Okay, we're gonna begin. So, welcome everybody. My name is Rabbi Yonah Schiller. I'm the executive director of the Hillel here. For those who has not been to this building before, raise your hand. Okay, great. So I just want to say, I'm going to say a few words. This introduction is going to be a little bit longer than the rest of the series as we make it through the year with the Big Issue series, only because it's our first kickoff event. And before I say another word, I do want to just thank our esteemed guests for being here, Lee Zurich, Buddy Roemer, and Melissa Harris-Perry. I also want to send a quick shout out to our steering committee, which has met and continues to meet as we continue to evolve this series. The next one's going to be in January, dealing with healthcare. I'd like to just send a call out to Corey Smith, Tanya Tetlow, Gordon Stewart, Michael Hecht, Stephanie Grace, Jordan Friedman, and Kyle Wedberg. So thank them for all of this. So one quick word about the building. This building has within it not only a restaurant, but an amazing restaurant. So if you have not been here before, it's open during the week from 10 in the morning to 7 at night. It's open to outside Tulane community as well as the Tulane community. It's organic, it's local, it's healthy, it's delicious. It also happens to be kosher. So those things oftentimes don't usually are included in the same sentence. But so I also the building is also open for public events similar to this. So if you have any ideas, if you're in the community, you want to see something happen, or you have an idea that you want to make happen, so we're here to help. So think about that and keep that in your back pocket. I'm just really excited to welcome everybody here and to launch the greatest next cultural contribution to New Orleans. This is the Big Issue. And this is the beginning of, like I said, a unique new debate series. I hope everyone had a chance to get a drink and at least say hello to somebody you have not yet met before. And if you haven't done that yet, so there will be dessert reception afterwards, and you can sample some of our yummy treats from the kitchen. And please stay around for that. The Big Issue is a new debate series, as I said. It looks to bring the conversation on pressing issues beyond media and partisan politics, to bring people together in Uptown to increase community and awareness, all within a fun and interactive format. First and foremost, we want you to have a good time, while walking away with something to think about as we get at some of the root issues that inform our society and all of our perspectives. It is my honor to introduce, I'd like to introduce Lee Zurich. who's going to go on to formally introduce our other participants. Lee joined Fox 8 in 2009 after a stint as a sports reporter and investigative reporter at WWL-TV. His work has earned numerous national awards, including the George F. Peabody and Alfred DuPont Awards, and Investigative Reporters and Editors Medal, and several Edward Murrow Awards. Lee co-anchors the Fox 9 and 10 o'clock newscasts and serves as the station's chief investigative reporter. Lee will be asking the tough questions tonight, and he will be the MC for this debate. Thank you, Lee.
Tough questions, wow. By the way, he talked about the facility being available. You may want to keep in mind that you can also rent it in the summer because the AC obviously works. So in the New Orleans summer, it wouldn't be a bad place. Thanks, everybody. It's always a good sign when there are more people than chairs, and we have that tonight. So thanks, everybody, for coming. I think it's going to be a fun night. We're going to try to keep it fairly loose, and hopefully it'll be a little fun for everybody and informative as well, too. Let's introduce our panelists tonight, and as we get some water for them too. First one is the real TV star in the room, Melissa Harris Perry. Anybody watch MSNBC in the room? Yes. Okay. Does anybody watch Fox News? The national, not the local. The national. There is a difference, by the way, between the national and the local. Just want to get that out there. Not saying I agree with anything.
Like there's a difference between the morning and the evening.
And there are differences. All right, Melissa is the host of MSNBC show Melissa Harris Perry. She also is a professor of political science at Tulane University. So we welcome her tonight. Thank you for being here. And we also have Governor Buddy Roemer, former Louisiana governor, also a member of Congress, and recently ran for president. And we welcome him as well. So let's get started. And the topic of tonight is America moving to the left. Was this election about ideology at all? And why doesn't that be our first question then? Is America moving to the left, Governor Roemer?
Well, 12.5 million people who voted 4 years ago didn't vote this time. So they're not moving anywhere. I don't think America's moving left. I see gridlock in Washington, and the same guy got elected president again. What's the movement? I've yet to hear a plan to move America forward. I look at a system that's not only broken, but is bought. Now, I guess I should learn to be more politically correct. I think America is looking to become better. America's at a better place right now than since I've ever been alive. I'm 69. I like America. I like some of the changes brought in the last 4 years. We finally got women's issues forefront. We finally started talking about ideas like homosexuality and whether those who adhere to that principle are real citizens. They are. And I think they're finally getting a place in our societies. So don't misunderstand me. I love America. And I'm positive about America. But I don't think this election moved at all.
And do you disagree?
I guess I'd say I think the evidence is mixed. I don't think that the outcome of the presidential election is an indication of leftward movement, right? So I would agree with Governor Roemer that the re-election of an incumbent during wartime who is young and tall is just overdetermined. There's just simply too many factors overdetermining the re-election of President Obama for us to understand that as a leftward drift. And I'd be happy to talk about what I think was going on in terms of the re-election of President Obama, but I don't think we can define it as left, if for no other reason because President Obama himself is not particularly left. President Obama is certainly in the Clinton model of a kind of rightward shifted Democratic Party, and although I think there are some elements of of Obama's first administration that might be read as more progressive on a variety of issues than even the first or even second administration of Clinton. I think we have to be really careful to assume that that election is about the left. I do think there are a couple of other pieces of evidence, though, that might suggest at least some maybe correction back to the middle from what has been a rightward drift over some period of time. One of the ballot initiatives that we saw go very differently in this election than we've seen previously. Part of that is the marriage equality ballots. So for the first time, marriage equality on a ballot ends up winning over and over again, right? And I still am a believer that fundamental civil rights do not belong on ballots, right? I don't want people voting on whether or not you have fundamental civil rights. But given that that gives us at least some measure of what's happening, the fact that you end up with wins on marriage equality is an indication of something moving. But the reason I'd be careful about that as a leftward drift is because when we look at the demographics, marriage equality is supported by everyone under a certain age and no one over a certain age, regardless of what their ideological position is. So we should see that more as a generational change than a leftward one. It's not as though older voters were convinced, it's that younger voters showed up in particular percentages in those states. And I think we can say the same thing about what happened around the defeat of all the rape deniers, because there was a bunch of rape deniers who were defeated, and defeated in states where people also voted for Governor Romney at the presidential level. So they weren't like a big Democratic turnout. It was Republican voters saying, I'm not going to support Aiken, or people, again, who didn't support the president but did support McCaskill and others. But again, I think we've got to be careful that that's a rightward, to indicate that it's a leftward shift, because I do think it has more to do with being responsive to this particular media cycle. Some of them still elected pro-life candidates. They just thought that this was sort of moving too far.
So what was the election about then? Either one of you.
Well, a couple of things come to mind. There's the whole horse race aspect. One person versus another. Every election has that in it. I think it was an election on what place do you see America having in a world that gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Can America be best represented by those in uniform or those in the Peace Corps? Can it be best represented by the goodness of America or the toughness of America? That was part of this election. And then finally, the reason so many people didn't vote. This was a very powerful election by the amount of people that didn't show up at all. I think that there's a growing dissatisfaction with both political parties and the state of political corruption in our country. And I think more and more people are feeling it. I talk to people every day. I was in Alexandria, Louisiana today. I gave a noon speech at their
Let's get closer to the mic so we can pick it up too.
Okay, good. I was in Alexandria, Louisiana today to give a presentation to the Chamber of Commerce. There had a couple hundred people, and I listened and talked to people every day across Louisiana, across Texas. I was in California last week doing the same thing. And people tell me that they're concerned, that they've never had this kind of economic concern. I noticed the unemployment rate in Spain was 23.6% announced last week. Do you know if we reported our unemployment rate the same as Spain does, our unemployment rate would be 18.1% in America? There is so much anxiety out there that a lot of people decided they couldn't vote for either one of these guys.
So you think the election was about people not turning out?
Absolutely. The real story for old politicians like me, and I used to be a campaign manager long before I ever ran for Congress or to be a member of the Constitutional Convention or to be governor of Louisiana or even for president. I worked in campaigns. I love politics. I love putting it together and managing a campaign and getting by with the minimum amount of money I can so that my candidate will be free to lead. That's my goal, free to lead. And in my experience, of more than 50 years running for office and being involved in office, I've never seen such dissatisfaction that was this time. There was not dissatisfaction at President Obama. I like him and people like him. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the system and what it's giving us and what our options are. People have a growing dissatisfaction.
What I would agree with on this, I do think that this election was about systems in a lot of ways. And the three that I would point out would be the Electoral College, voter suppression, and the Republican Party. So I'll just go through this real quickly. I think part of what you see in terms of a decline of voter turnout, or the number of individuals who actually vote, has everything to do with the Electoral College. And the sense that people feel like they live in states that are safely red or safely blue, and they don't feel like they have to show up to vote because their votes simply don't count. So I think that the system is inherently disenfranchising, in part because folks are so much more connected to presidential elections than to any other. And to the extent that the presidential election becomes about Florida, 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 or Ohio, 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 and if you live in, well, no one lives in Wyoming, but if you lived in Wyoming, or New York, or any of these other states, right, you might feel a sense of the kind of damping of the meaning of your vote. So I think that's part of it. Part of the Electoral College, I would also say...
Well, I know many people in Louisiana who said their vote didn't matter.
Right. So so this is why I say the second aspect is voter suppression. I want to just label two aspects of voter suppression. It was fascinating how many people in New York and Louisiana and other places who did vote, the uptick in turnout, particularly among African Americans and Latinos, and that does seem to be more responsive to a desire to protect the franchise than it does to the particular candidates. So it was kind of the narrative I think that's emerged is 2008 was about Obama and 2012 was about us, right? That's sort of the framework, in the sense of as the discourse about the possibility of voter suppression became more nationalized, more folks thought it became, and so what we saw was an uptick in very particular populations, and those are the populations that also had an expectation of voter suppression efforts. But there was one other voter suppression effort I just don't want to leave, and this is the one that is built very much into the system, and that is the partisan gerrymandering. So when we look at the vote for the U.S. House of Representatives, 500,000 people in America, 500,000 more people in the United States of America voted for Democratic candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives than voted for Republicans for the U.S. House of Representatives. But the Republicans in the U.S. House have a very safe and clear majority. That's because elections matter, particularly decennial elections. And so in 2010, when Republicans won state houses all across the country, they redrew districts in a way that is completely legal vis-a-vis the Supreme Court, which is partisan gerrymandering, which kept Republicans very safe in their seats. And so that's a kind of voter suppression effort we don't think of, because it's not like I'm going to go and keep you from voting, but it does mean I'm going to keep your vote from mattering much, because I can draw a district which can be safely partisan for the next 10 years, and it is completely legal and in our system to do it, and that's one of the fundamental reforms that we need. The third thing I would say is just the Republican Party has a tradition of always nominating the guy whose turn it is. And you ran last time, and now it's your turn this time, and they did that again this time, even though Republicans didn't really like Mitt Romney, and so, but it was his turn, so he got nominated, and then you saw that lack of enthusiasm for Romney in the context of the campaign. So there were candidates who could have won President Obama, John Huntsman.
Like who? Like who?
John Huntsman. In a general election, John Huntsman, in a debate, one-on-one with President Obama, having worked for him, being able to take it to him on all those questions of policy, particular foreign policy, and I mean, that could have been an ugly battle. But he can't win the nominating process, right? So again, this is a different kind of voter suppression, right? You can't win that primary, you don't end up the candidate, and then you end up with someone like Mitt Romney, who got pulled very, very far to the right, and then just sort of didn't have the ability to build that big middle coalition.
So did Obama win, or did Romney lose?
I mean, I think there was certainly a bit of both. The president had a lot of clarity about how he had to win, and they had a strategy that allowed them about 4 different paths to that Electoral College 270. In that sense, I would say he won. He let North Carolina go because he didn't need to have it. President Obama clearly could have won North Carolina, but he didn't try because he needed the other, he had 4 other paths to victory, didn't need North Carolina. So it was a very lean and careful campaign. On the other hand, Mitt Romney made a variety of choices, I think, that also helped him to lose the election.
What do you think, Governor?
I think President Obama won. I'll speak now as an old campaign manager. He knew where he had to get the vote turnout. And for months, they worked block by block, house by house. For months. They focused. They were flexible in their approach. They did a masterful job. At running that election. And he clearly won. I tried in the Republican primary. I was not asked to be in any debates, although I had been both a congressman and a governor, the only one running who had. And I said, if the Republicans want to have a chance to become president, they're going to have to defeat President Obama. And he is articulate, charismatic, likable, and you better put your best team out there. And so I would join with the common wisdom that maybe Mitt Romney was not the best candidate. But the way you asked your question, did Mitt Romney lose or did Barack Obama win? It's clearly Barack Obama won.
All right, let's try to get some of you involved, either with questions or comments. We'll just kind of work our way around the room a little bit. Just raise your hand if you want to say something, and we'll take a couple things, then you can talk. And try to make them somewhat brief, we don't long-winded questions.
Oh, okay, thanks. Melissa Herster, I love your show, so thank you so much. I was wondering when you said Mitt Romney, so Republicans pick the guy whose turn it is. And I've been wondering about that. It seems like to survive the Republican primary process, you have to shift way to the right in order to excite the base, the people who actually vote in the primary election. And forgive me, I'm a Democrat, so to me, my perspective, my bias, it looked like the Republican candidates had to double down on crazy to get the vote, and then that's just not possible to win the national election once you're recorded saying lots of things that are wildly unpopular with women and anyone of color or.
What do y'all think of that?
So, it's one of those media problems. So we tell the story like, oh, and now this is happening, and now this is happening, and now this is happening. But the fact is, I could have told you in 2010 that Mitt Romney was going to be the nominee of the Republican Party. I mean, I couldn't have quite told you exactly how it was all going to happen, and that, there was going to be a battle of Newt Gingrich, and then this one, so like the details of it, but I could have told you it was going to be John McCain, and then it was going to be Mitt Romney. So I guess what I would say is what Democrats have been better at is keeping people whose turn it is from not necessarily taking that place. And when we've done the turn, we lose. So like you'll notice, no one knew who Jimmy Carter was. I mean, this is peanut farmer in Georgia, right? And then there was that guy who was governor of Arkansas. Yeah, that was just came out of nowhere. And then there was a guy who'd been a state senator 15 seconds before, right? And he becomes the so and yet you hear us right now, you hear Democrats right now screaming and hollering about Hillary Clinton. And like I guess what I would say is what will be exciting about 2016 is it's not clear that it's anybody's turn. One might think it's Paul Ryan's, but not really. It's usually not the losing VP candidate. So the Republicans are going to be wide open in 2016, and I suspect some of the dynamics that you've seen with the rightward drift are going to be very different because these folks are going to be coming out of the South, but people of color or women, so Nikki and Bobby. And you're going to see Susana Martinez coming out of the Southwest. I mean, it's just, I suspect you're going to see a different, not a left party or something, but that there will be some differences in the valence of the Republicans.
You don't think you'll have to go way right to win the nomination in 2016?
I mean, you're going to be way right on some things, and I think part of it will depend on where we are, both in terms of the economy. But think about George W. Bush winning the nomination. He won as compassionate conservative guy. He didn't win as far right. I mean, we think of him now as far right because it was post 9/11, but you gotta like walk back to 2000 and remember him as, I'm gonna go, education? Republicans have been trying to kill the Department of Education since it was initiated. And he came in and was like, I'm down with education. And I kind of love black and brown people. Did you see how many of their votes I got? In other words, I would expect a return in a Afghanistan war, post-Iraq war, post-first black president, a return to the big tent politics of George W. Bush. That's my bet today.
What do you think, Governor Roemer?
And the key question I remember from the primaries, and I tweeted real time with every debate because I couldn't get invited.
Let me just say, he's 69 years old and he's on Twitter. That's impressive.
I had to be taught. It was a painful thing, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. But there was a debate in Iowa, number 8 or 9 of the 23 nationally televised debates. And the moderator, I forget his name, asked a very good question. He said, if you are president and you have a chance to sign a measure that would reduce the deficit with $9 in spending cut for every $1 in tax increase. Remember that question? 9 to 1. Would you do it? Not a single nominee in the Republican primary raised his or her hand to say that they would be a president of the United States with the courage to do both, if that's what it took. 9 to 1. And John Huntsman, that she praised, didn't lift his little grubby hand.
Thanks for holding back your thoughts.
And I would agree that's exactly what happened, and yet what we've seen is the shedding of Grover Norquist since the election. So I guess I would say that I think that's exactly a completely apt description, and of course none of them raise their hand because of the Norquist pledge, and yet it's the first thing they give up. We're not even in the lame duck yet, and they're like, whatever, Grover who? So so I suspect you'll see a change.
All right, let's get to our next. I do have some Twitter jealousy, by the way. Governor, you have 32,000 followers on Twitter. Melissa has 126,000. I have 4,500, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad that. Question over here.
David Smith, physician from San Francisco, big Melissa Harris Perry fan, and been reading about Governor Roemer thanks to my friends in New Orleans. I was
You here on vacation, by the way?
visiting our twin grandsons and learning about New Orleans. I was surprised in your comments that you did not talk about healthcare reform. To me, that was the mega issue. Governor Romney began by saying he was going to appeal Obamacare. To me, that was the biggest issue in this campaign, and yet in your opening remarks, you did not mention it. I know you're going to cover it at a different time, and I've heard you cover it on your show, but I was surprised that in your review of this election, to me, the most important thing was healthcare reform.
Yeah, there's not evidence out of the exit polling that it was the most important thing. All I would say is, yeah, sure, absolutely. I'm just saying that, like, if I'm thinking about sort of what are the big trends that caused the election, outcomes the way they did, most voters, in part, most voters weren't making that decision on health care because, of course, Obamacare and Romneycare were reasonably similar to one another. I think that it would, here's where I think the American Affordable Care Act could have been the deciding issue. If the Roberts Court had determined that it was unconstitutional. If the court had turned back the constitutionality of ACA, then I think the president's signature domestic policy achievement would have become his great albatross, and that the GOP would have just hammered it, and it would have been that he was a great failure, and that he was also willing to shred the Constitution, right? At this point it was just a discursive talking point, but if his main domestic legislation had been determined to be unconstitutional, I think that would have allowed that to move forward as a conversation piece. But just from my perspective, it never quite got the traction among American voters. And what's fascinating is watching all these states' rights governors thinking that apparently 2016 is going to be about the Affordable Care Act because they are currently doing the stand-in-the-door, refuse Medicaid expansion, despite the fact that the election's over. It's a very odd sort of response on the part of Republican governors.
Thank you.
All right. Welcome to New Orleans, by the way. Let's try to move to the back a little bit.
If I could,
yeah, please.
I'm a diabetic. I've been a diabetic for 50 years. I have an insulin fund. And I supported President Obama's attempt to reform health care. He did a poor job of it. There's a gaping wound in America in terms of health care. You can't afford to be sick. And insurance does not make you healthy. We need radical reform. We need a president free to lead on the issue of you cannot buy health care across a state line. Did you know that? It's against the national law. You have 50 monopolies. You do not have competition in pharmaceutical costs. Do you know that the Affordable Health Care Act prevented the importation of sanctioned drugs from Canada, licensed in America, at 40% the cost of Americans? Now, I'm an old man, and I know what my biggest expense is, my insulin. And it costs twice as much in this country as it does in Canada. Now, if you want to reform health care, you lower the cost for every American. And then you can concentrate on coverage. There's a way to do this. But you know why they don't do it? Dr. Smith, is it?
Yes.
You know why they don't do it, Dr. Smith? That's right. You see what he did? Money. The biggest contributor to these damn politicians are the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies. And they won't move. And President Obama found that out. You know who the first person he called? Billy Tozan, the chief lobbyist for the pharmaceutical lobby. And he said, look, don't oppose my bill, and I'll protect you in it. That's the way you make laws in America. That wasn't reform. It was a political victory.
Lesson learned, by the way, if you tell Governor Roemer what you do for a living, he may call you out on it. All right, next question back.
I was going to switch topics kind of to campaign finance reform, and I heard the stat, something about $6 billion was spent during this campaign, and you have a very similar situation that you had 4 years ago. And I guess I had two questions. One was that, you know, the super PACs came about, I want to say because it was a Republican-led charge to allow them to happen. I could be trying to get about that, but did the Republicans get beat at their own game because of that? Is my first question. And then the second question is, do you think that in 2016 or the next intermediate election, is there going to be a change in the campaign finance reform to stop an obscene amount of spending or to curb it?
Who wants to take that one first? Governor Roemer?
There's going to be a change, and we're working with members of Congress to see what that change should look like. I think it should include full disclosure. Without arbitrarily setting limits on gifts, which is a form of speech, and I know money is important to politics, and I'm not going to change the world. Money will still be important to politics. But don't you think we should know where a politician gets her money or his money? And we should know it within 48 hours of when they get it, so we can make relevant decisions. Number two, I think lobbyists ought not be allowed to contribute to campaigns monetarily. You can bring an idea, you can bring a big idea, but you can't bring a big check, and it ought to be against the law. Number three, we ought to require that the sort of PAC contributions we make in this country are no greater than the limit for individual contributions. Here's the law now, and I helped write it years ago. It's been modified many times. We had this debate on the floor of the Congress. I was a Democrat, a conservative Democrat, but arguing for campaign reform. And many of the Republicans opposed me. But here was the debate. The liberals wanted limits. The conservative wanted disclosure. I think we can have the best of both worlds. Limit PACs to no more than what an individual can give. Now an individual can give $2,500. A PAC can give $5,000. It ought to be taken to $2,500 for everybody. And then finally, I think super PACs ought to be eliminated. Here's the law after Citizens United was ruled on by the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision. They ruled that super PACs, if uncoordinated and independent, have no limits. Well, let me tell you how uncoordinated these super PACs are. Mitt Romney spoke to the fundraiser of his own damn super PAC. So that's coordinated. President Obama at a speech in the press room of the White House, called on his cabinet to get involved in raising money for his super PAC. Am I right, Melissa? It is a joke, and it ought to be changed. Congress has the power to change it. I and a group of Americans, both parties and independents, are going to spend the next couple of years in Washington getting some decent campaign reform. It is the first step, Doctor, to health care reform. It is the first step to bank reform. It is the first step to tax reform. The big boys have never had it so well. You're paying the bill, they aren't, and they get a free ride because they slip a little check to the politicians. We're going to change it.
Doctor, whether you like it or not, I think you're going to be called out tonight. I think we're going to go back to more of your questions because you obviously get Governor Roemer more worked up than I do. Here we go.
Hey, Governor Roemer. I was just wondering if you could elaborate more on how you keep saying that candidates should be free to lead, because as you're explaining rather emphatically, obviously there's an issue with the institutions and there's an issue with politics, and that, you know, there's no such thing as far as I'm concerned, as a politician really being free to lead. You're constricted by the very institution you work for.
Sure.
And by the politicians that surround you. So really, do you ever, one, could you define what you mean by that? And two, do you ever see a politician being free to lead?
Yes, and you make a very wise point, is that we all have certain limitations on our actions. Our sense of right and wrong, our daily experiences and the experience that come from that give us some guidance. Some might go to a church or a temple to get that kind of guidance. There are a variety of things that impact us. And no woman, elected president or man, is going to be free. So when I say free to lead, I mean free from a corruption that's in the system now, based on special interest needs and the money they're from. So I maybe should take time to explain it every time I use the phrase. I don't mean in a perfect world you have no influence on you. I like when a president has to be a politician. I like when Abraham Lincoln has to work so hard to get the 13th Amendment passed by buying those 20 votes. You know, you have to do things. I mean, I was governor of a corrupt state. You know, and I wasn't that good a governor. I lost my re-election to two guys who went to prison. I know. People in New Hampshire couldn't believe me. They go, wow. I mean, I finished third to David Duke, a race hater, and Edwin Edwards. And they both went to the federal penitentiary. But I know. So I'm not here as an expert, okay? I'm just telling you, I've worked in a state that's come a long way in the last 25 years because we fought corruption. We need to do that in Washington. And it's not about Barack Obama. It's about the system. The system.
Melissa, when are you going to book him as a guest? By the
Oh,
way?
he's been on.
Okay.
He's been on repeatedly. In fact, I love Buddy Roemer as a guest, in part because he has been a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, all things, and so we can have all kinds of conversations. But you know, I want to bookend that as well. I mean, look, and I love that you went to the Lincoln movie here, because part of it is that the founders want a system that is very difficult to move, right? I mean, if you want an efficient system with a free leader, like Tehran is nice this time of year, you know, there are systems where all sorts of things can happen very quickly because there isn't a democratic process, and there isn't a bureaucracy, and there aren't, you know, these competing. So, you know, we have founders and a system that is meant to move slowly. With, like, you know, gridlock, I mean, I'm not sure how important that is if you end up with good outcomes on the other side. But I do think, you know, part of, you know, if we go back to the founders, part of it was the way they managed that was to shrink the electorate, right? To keep it a very narrow group of people who would be able to hold accountable leaders. And as our electorate has expanded exponentially over anything the founders initially imagined, with women and young people and people of color and all of those folks in the electorate, you nonetheless have this enormous sort of popular and populist base, but this much smaller influential base that is still about the money, property, interest. And so the question earlier was, did the populist base beat the money base? You know, did the Republicans get beat because, and I think the answer to that is no. Like, if you think that President Obama didn't spend a lot of money, and a lot of the money didn't come from undisclosed sources, and you know, that, I mean, it's just one form of money beat another, and I do think that there was a way in which individual voters who were excited about pushing back against voter suppression did show up despite some of the money being thrown at it, but they weren't people who were ever going to vote for Romney. They were just people who might not have voted, right? And so that it's a different sort of thing to claim that the money didn't make a difference. I think it clearly did.
All right, who else has questions? Let's go over here. Yes, ma'am.
Governor Roemer, you are our first education reform governor. I know because I was there, somewhat fighting you all the way. However, I would like you to comment about the state of education in Louisiana.
Okay.
Jindal's Act 1 and 2, because education should be the top priority of this country.
Right.
It is essential to moving America forward.
Right.
So I would like your comment on our current governor and how, in my estimation, he has really messed up education in this state.
Next question. You know, there's a little club of former governors, and we try not to, you know, just let me honor that, okay? But I do want to answer your question. Many of the things that he's proposed, I do like. I want to pick on those. Yeah, many of the things that Governor Jindal has proposed, I like. I do think that classroom performance needs to be enhanced. And whether he has the right tool to do that, I'm not sure, but at least he's trying. That's one of the targets. The voucher program has to be carefully done, and I'm not ready to endorse that for a lot of reasons. I'm a public school boy myself, Bossier High School, and that's part of my life. That I did go to Harvard. I never admit that in speeches in Louisiana. And I went to the Harvard Business School. I've never mentioned that anywhere. But I do believe that our future is K through 12 in this state. And I'm going to give Bobby Jindal a grade. I'm going to give him a strong B+, and I know you don't like that, for his attention and trying to move education. I think he's made some bad steps in this, but at least it seems to be his top priority, and I like that. What I like most of all, finally, is that we're giving parents a chance to learn more about their child's school by giving the school a grade. Now look, if we grade the students, we ought to grade the schools. And I'll tell you about my school, Bossier High School. It got a C this year. And we celebrated all around the world because last year we were a D. And you know who I give credit to realizing that we had improved? Bobby Jindal. And so I know you don't like him, and I know you disagree with him, but I want to be deadly honest with you. I'd rather have Bobby Jindal trying than some governors who didn't try at all.
Melissa, yeah.
Yeah, so on the show, we have one of the hashtags that we use is hashtag FBJ, forget Bobby Jindal. No. God, I wish he would. Then he'd get his hands off of the Louisiana schools. There are actually things about Bobby Jindal that I think are fine, normal, whatever, interesting, quirky. Governor Jindal's education policy, I think, is horrifying. and almost an exact replica of the Department of Education under President Obama and Arne Duncan. I think that the convergence of the left and the right, of the Democratic and Republican Party, on the exact same set of beliefs about education in this country is one of the most astonishing shifts in American politics that has happened over the course of the past 20 years. I think that we understand it very little. In other words, understanding sort of how that happens. I think George W. Bush, who I was talking about earlier, is a big part of that narrative, but it gets smushed behind what happens with him as a war president. So because when we think about the Bush years, we think primarily about the responses to 9/11 and the war in Iraq. I think we sort of forgot what was happening on the domestic side in terms of particularly the education agenda. The fact that this president has not only followed and sometimes doubled down on those policies, but indicated quite clearly that while there'll be a number of personnel changes in the second term, he is not going to change Arne Duncan for, as far as I can tell, because he enjoys him on the weekly basketball pickup team. I think, in fact, not only do I think there's very clear evidence that voucher systems and school choice are really about one thing. They're about killing teachers' unions. I think that teachers' unions should feel free to be criticized. I think there's a lot to critique about how teachers' unions operate, but I think the fundamental principle that student interests and teacher interests are somehow in opposition to one another is not only false, but dangerous to the point of the gutting of our public school system. I think it is fascinating that in this state, Bobby Jindal has managed to convince black people that segregation is good. As far as I can tell, that Suno fight, I mean, I had just moved here and I was like, I'm sorry, are we fighting for segregation? We are fighting for segregation. Okay, and we're gonna call it history and culture, but I'm telling you, like, I know you don't hear it because you're local, but when you step back, if you took those words and you just pasted them, they sound exactly like what white supremacists said in the 1960s about school. I mean, not any different, not one word different about culture and history and my family and my community and where I'm, my family, people, exactly the same language. And then when you look at these charter schools, which are the most segregated schools in our country everywhere, and over and over again, their profit motivation, the extent to which they absolutely lie about student outcomes, the extent to which they have killed all aspects of education and actually make people into college students. I have taught at Tulane, I have taught at North Carolina Central, I have taught at the University of Chicago, I have taught at Princeton, I've taught the best students in the country, the smartest 20-some-year-olds, and all of them come from schools where nobody was testing the hell out of them. Every last one of them come from schools where they sort of wandered around and ate an apple and did a project and thought about themselves. And then when something happened and they had a learning disability, then they got more time to take their tests. And that, like, the difference between what happens to children of privilege, because my child is a child of privilege in the New Orleans school, so she's in a private school. So when they discovered that she was performing poorly on tests, the world showed up. Specialists showed up, new kinds of pencils and how to hold them, extra time showed up. Well, I think that now she needs glasses, and on top of that, I think that she gets low blood sugar, so we will bring raisins when she takes the test. Because Louise McGee is going to make sure that at the end of the day, every single one of their students are equally accomplished, right? If you show up in the Louisiana public schools and you haven't lived in your own home for 6 months, and someone was shot outside your door, and you haven't had a box of raisins because you are food insecure, and it's the end of the month, and you don't have sufficient food stamps to make it, and you do poorly on a test, then they shut your school. Yeah. And like the difference between how we treat students, and then all the kids who end up in these classrooms are from the kinds of schools that my kid went to, and you know where those kids end up? Who are in the charter schools that we are all fighting to have in the vouchers? They're in jail with Buddy Roemer's friends. They're hanging out with Edwards. Like, what we teach, and this is the last thing because I could go on all day, so I will pull back, but I will just say, if you just...
You don't have to stop if you don't want to.
If you just look at what we teach, take a KIPP school, where what you teach kids is to stand in line and wear a uniform and listen to orders and show up on time. What you have just done is to teach them how to be the best prisoner on the yard. And if you come in my classroom at Tulane wearing a uniform and standing in line and not speaking until spoken to, and you will fail. You have to come with some original ideas and the willingness to make mistakes and the ability to connect two different things together. And then you have to go run and play a sport in the afternoon. And then after that, you got to play the cello for a couple hours. And because that's the kid that's going, and the president of the United States is always the dude who did all of that, not the person who came. And so this whole notion of soft bigotry, of low expectations is ridiculous. We have lowered the expectations so low that we think all you got to do is be able to add and subtract and say, all of that said, do we need dramatic reform? Absolutely. Did Bobby Jindal destroy the schools in Louisiana? No. He had a lot of help. They were a mess. And okay, very final thing, when you look at the schools in Louisiana, in Alabama, in Mississippi, in much of the U.S. South, you will see that there was an absolute stoppage point for physical plants. So there was a time in the city of New Orleans where no one ever built another school. And that day occurred when integration occurred. And then there were no more schools. And then there were no more buses. I mean, I talk about this with public infrastructure all the time. Integration led to the end of public infrastructure investment in most of the U.S. South. And people voted with their feet, and they opted out of U.S. cities, and they opted out of the U.S. South public system. They opted into this very robust Catholic system, into the very robust private school system that my kid is now a part of. And the fact that we now no longer even talk about integration or neighborhood schools or bands or music programs or any of that as a relevant part of our discourse, I think is national, and I think it is both parties, and I think you're right, it is the most dangerous thing happening in the country.
I agree with a little bit of what you said, but damn little. And I don't tell jokes about it. I've lived my life as an integrationist, not a segregationist. I've made the votes, I've walked the lines. I'll give you two facts you can take home tonight and think about it. And I'd like to know what your answer is. Number one, when I graduated from high school, America ranked first in the world in the percentage of its citizens who had graduated from high school. Number one, 1960. You know where we rank today? 17th. Second fact, Louisiana ranks no better than 48 in any measure of the education quality among the 50 states. Now let me just, the question was about Bobby Jindal, not my theory of education. Bobby Jindal is right on target of not accepting the status quo. Does he go too far in some areas? Maybe. But what we've got is a failure. I'll measure it one final way. When I was governor, we had 8 congressmen. How many will we have January 15th, Melissa? 6. The only state in America that's lost 25% of its relative population to other states. You know why? Young people don't have an opportunity here. They don't get the education. They don't have the skills. They can't stay here and enjoy New Orleans. Hell, they've got to go somewhere else to get a job. The key to our future is not who our governor is, not what party runs, not how long you and I are on television together. The key to our future is the quality of our education. And I like choice, I like chance, I like opportunity, and I like putting the child first, not the teacher and not the organized labor representative. I had 15 meetings the first year as governor with organized teacher union. You know how many times the word child was mentioned? 0. It was about tenure. It was about tenure. It was about tenure. It was about their pay. I'm telling you, it's time to get serious about our kids. And playing these, and you talk about President Obama and his man Arnie Duncan. It's the best part of what he's done. He has stood up for kids all over America.
But as a matter of, so you brought up data. As a matter of data, unionized states have much better schools. And less choice actually leads to better schools because they lead to neighborhood schools. So when you live in communities that, the main thing that contributes to good schools are high property taxes, period.
So you think the answer is neighborhood schools?
So
How are you going to get that in this country?
well, we
They'll
have it in
all
this
be
country.
white, they'll
We
all
have-
be black, they'll
they-
all be
What do you think the
Hispanic?
charter schools are right now? I guess what I would
I
say
want to
is,
know what your answer is, Melissa.
I'm gonna tell you. So I think the answer is massive investment of public funds to public schools, not vouchers that take public funds and send them to private schools, which is what the voucher system does. And the charter system basically does the same thing. It removes accountability by allowing one-off schools that actually do far more than neighborhood public schools, actually leads to a system where people get to kind of experiment on kids 1 year on and off. The failure rate for charter schools is extraordinarily high compared to public school systems in terms of just the closure rate. So kids start at a school, 3rd and 4th grade, it doesn't end up serving them, they end up moving on to it, and we know, of course, that education is cumulative. So these are, I actually would argue that the narrative that comes out of education reformers, as it is currently defined, is mostly based on ideology and not based on facts. Because when we look at the data, we see that when teachers are well paid, when they are accountable, but accountability is not about high-stakes testing. Accountability is about school leaders having freedom to make choices within those schools. That can happen very clearly within a system that allows robust tenure and opportunities for professional development. Those things are not counter to the interests of students. Having well-paid teachers who don't have to work a second job, who have health insurance, is beneficial to kids. Having teachers who can stay after school and who do stay is having after-school activities. It's beneficial to kids, and all of those things are being shoved out of the current system. And I think, I think what I would agree with is you and I undoubtedly think that what's happening in the New Orleans and the Louisiana schools is abysmal. And I don't think Jindal is anywhere close to being alone for responsible for this. I think that responsibility and culpability is broad. But I'm just telling you, when you look at the best school systems, there are places with high property taxes in neighborhood schools where everybody wakes up in the morning and is like, bye kid, and the kid walks down the street and goes to the neighborhood school, and everyone has an equal sense of accountability in that school. And as soon as everybody's voting with their feet in so-called school choice, what you have is a creaming of the population where a few who already are the most privileged end up with the best resources and everybody else doesn't. It doesn't build the system.
Well, let me say, I can't speak for other states. I'll just speak for Louisiana, because this is where my experience is. The teacher unions have it in Louisiana where you cannot fire an incompetent teacher. That's a fact. That's what we fought. I'll tell you a story. There were almost 100,000 teachers when I was governor. And 1 year, I discovered that out of the 81,000, you know how many were terminated that year? One. The system is bad, Melissa. And I'm interested in positive ways to make it better. And that's what Obama's tried to do with Duncan.
Let me just say this. The most robust part of our entire educational system, the one that is still the absolute envy of the world, is our American system of higher education, which is imperfect in a lot of ways, but it is, you're making this point about, like, we were number one. We number one in higher education.
We are.
And we have an incredible, you want to talk about something you can't fire. I mean, you have to sort of have a pattern of sexually harassing your students over.
Melissa.
Right, and so what I was going to say is, breaking teacher tenure at higher education wouldn't improve schools. The reason that our schools are so great is because we have restricted admissions processes and we have extreme resources. And that's the same reason that private schools in this country are great, and it's the same reason that charter schools are great, and it's the same reason the voucher schools. It's not because they're doing something, and it's not because the teachers are accountable. It's because they get to cream their populations and they get a lot of resources to educate their kids. And when you have those two things, education turns out fine. And all I'm suggesting is what we ought to do is instead of continuing to find ways to just narrow that funnel of who ends up in a good classroom and act as though teachers are the problem, there's just too much empirical evidence that says that's not the problem.
One final word from Governor Roemer.
If my dad came back from World War II, he was a bomber pilot, and he served his country, and he got offered the GI Bill to pay for his college education. You know what was interesting about that bill? He could choose any college he wanted. Catholic, Jewish, public, private. That was the law in America. The difference between colleges, universities, and K through 12 is that you have no choice K through 12. The difference in college is you choose your college.
No, you don't.
And if it doesn't, yes you do.
No, you don't.
They don't have to take you, but you choose who you apply to. Oh, here's my point. If you don't like where you're getting treated in college, you can go to another one. Try that in the 3rd grade if your parents are unhappy. You try it sometime. You know where you're sent to public schools? Where you happen to be born or live. There's a big difference. And what Arne Duncan and Barack Obama and what Governor Jindal are trying to do is to give some choice to these kids. It will improve the system.
All right, who's got the next hot topic for us? Try to top that.
Well, you found one we disagree on. We agree about a lot.
Yeah, you do, actually. All right, let's go over here.
I have sort of a niche question. Ms. Harris-Carey, you mentioned the Latino vote in the last election. I'm from Texas. Do you think sort of the prominence of this demographic will be enough to swing Texas in the next election?
Well, I don't think the Latinos are inherently Democrats. I think, Latino vote, 70-some-odd% went to the Republican Party, went to the Democratic Party this time. But I don't think there's any reason, at least at this moment, to assume that the Latino vote will look like the African American vote. There's more reason to think that the Latino vote will ultimately look like kind of the white ethnic vote, of Irish and other folks. The question of whether or not it turns into a 75, 85, 9% block vote, I think is whether or not the Republican Party continues to make the mistake of racializing a set of policies and denigrating a whole population of people around those racialized policies. So this is kind of what happened around the immigration discourse and the anchor baby discourse and all of this, where someone might be, 6th, 7th, 8th generation, but as soon as you start saying stuff like that, right, it has this reflective capacity back. But if you think about George W. Bush coming out of Texas, having received 20% of the African American vote and a majority of the Latino vote in Texas, I just don't think there's any reason to assume that demographically that there is an inherent outcome. Now, if the Republicans continue to behave badly, and if the Democrats continue to sort of build on what they've accomplished here, then after maybe 4 more election cycles, then you end up with a circumstance where Latino voters, particularly Southwestern, Chicano, Mexican American voters, the Cubano thing is interesting what's going on in Florida, in part because you have this new Puerto Rican vote in the Orlando area and Tampa area, which is fascinating. Like that changed what happened in Florida this time because it wasn't just a Cubano vote, there was this Puerto Rican vote, so it was interesting. But all of that to say, particularly the sort of large Mexican American Southwestern vote, I just don't think we know yet that those demographics are destiny for the Democratic Party.
Let's do one more question. I think we had one right over here. Excuse me. Can I speak through here for a second? Sorry.
How do you think children going to school hungry because their parents don't make anything much past minimum wage and don't work 40 hours affects education?
It has a terrible effect. And I think that's why, many people don't want to talk about the economics of creating jobs, but I always think that's a key issue in our society. Do we have opportunity? Are we treated fairly when we apply to those jobs? There are a variety of issues there. But America is now on a global stage. I was in Los Angeles last year during the campaign, and the man who has become the leader of China was there, Xi. and he was cutting a ribbon in the port of Los Angeles about the wonderful trade between America and China. He said it was 133 billion US dollars in a single year, more than between any two spots in the world. He was very proud of that. I checked those numbers. 122 billion was from China to America. 11 billion was from America to China. So, you know, one of the issues, and I don't mean to pick on education, something has to be first. I think education is the most important. But this issue that you touched is very, very important as well. It does affect performance in the classroom. It does affect happiness at home. It does affect how we feel about ourselves. If a person doesn't have a job and they want to work, they really can't be free from the anxiety and the pressures and all the things that are involved. That's why I spent so much time talking about how our corrupt system really grinds jobs away. I'll give you one example and then let Melissa take my spot on this question. One example. Our tax code allows American companies to close a plant in America, build a plant in China, and then send the goods made by cheap Chinese labor in these modern plants back to America at no penalty. And companies like GE do it all the time. And these are the sorts of things that I expect a Congress and a president to stand up for and stop. And it's not happening in our country now for more than 20 years, since we did away with Glass-Steagall in 1999 under Bill Clinton, and George Bush bailed out the Wall Street Bank, and Obama turned his head. We've had 3 presidents that let our country get in this economic collapse, and it is a problem.
Melissa?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly the buddy's right that, like, when we think about economics, we have to think of it globally. There's no way to imagine, like, creating jobs in a fully domestic way, or but on the very narrow question of student performance and poverty, which I think is a slightly different question. I mean, I guess I say there are 2 things. One, our willingness as a country to countenance the amount of childhood poverty that there is, because we are prepared to punish what we see as the immoral or unethical decisions of parents, is pretty extraordinary for our nation. And the part of what sort of makes the American engine run has been that for most of our history, we had among the world's first world nations the greatest economic mobility generation to generation. So being born poor might mean you died poor, but it also might not mean that you would die poor. Economic mobility was almost always up. So like usually rich people, they just got to manage to stay rich. It was pretty hard to like be born rich and then manage to end up poor. But there was economic mobility up. That has stagnated and stopped. So that now we actually rank pretty low in the capacity of people born poor to do anything other than die poor. And that, what I think part of what Buddy's capturing when he's talking about having a job, I think it's that economic mobility issue, the idea that one circumstance from childhood is going to define your entire adulthood, that it is going to define your circumstances. And so even when we think, I mean, so I have all kinds of issues with the notion of how we measure success and high-stakes testing and all of that. But on the most basic level, when we look at the effects of living in poor neighborhoods on children, even when those children are poor. So my husband and I battle about this, not between each other, but with ourselves. We live in a poor neighborhood. We are not poor people. We live in a poor neighborhood. We make a choice to live in a poor neighborhood. It's extremely important to us to stay where we are, to stay in our community, and we cope with not only the poverty around us, but the crime around us, and all of those challenges. And we do so with a young daughter, and with a recognition of everything we know about the data that tell us that being born in or living in a poor neighborhood as a child has very real impact on their sense of security in their world, their sense of mobility and capacity. And it's a choice that we make and that we wrestle with and that we make and that we wrestle with and she's, I mean, and I might be a bad parent. Like, you know, like I just want to lay that on the table. It's a very real possibility. But we are always operating with choice, right? So as bad as it is, I mean, we've had moments like last Christmas when they broke in and stole all the Christmas presents, although they were very nice thieves because they unwrapped the Christmas presents first and only stole the electronics and left all the doll clothes, which were harder to, but then they rode away on our bikes. But, you know, you come home and your Christmas has been, and you know, just sort of imagine, so we thought about leaving at that point, right? And we didn't. But the fact is we could have, but what happens when when there is no choice, when there's no option, when you're not just opting in? And so I have a real clear sense of how, not just the questions of the wants in a very physical sense, but that sense of how a neighborhood and our communities can impact our sense of what is possible, and then add on to all of that the narratives about race and poverty that are the broadest definitions in our country about who does and doesn't succeed. That is why I don't think you can therefore measure what success is with a math score. Like it's, because for some kids, the fact that they are in school every day is an A. Because they're hungry, and there's no parent home, and they don't have a coat to wear, but they're in school every day, they deserve an A. Like, because, you know, good luck you doing that, right? So, but we don't have any way of measuring that kind of thing, or rewarding that aspect of who, you know.
How are we going to bring up a child to be ready to think? To
If they can't eat.
When their belly is screaming out.
Yeah.
That's my point.
Yeah.
And they're not going to get it at school. They're not, you know, because they're going to get a meal. That's not going to get them through.
Well, we used to feed people in this country, and then we decided it was too expensive, and we had an election where people actually used food stamps as a wedge issue. That happened this year.
Any final thoughts from both of you?
Last month, 420,000 additional people got on food stamps last month. So you are right, and I believe that 45% of them were children under the age of 12. So it is a powerful thing, and I don't want to just skip over it and say, well, there's an easy solution, because there isn't. But the difference between those at the top and those at the bottom has actually widened in this country in the last 20 years. And it ought to be of concern to us, no matter our party or where we're from, because it does affect us all. And I don't have an easy answer. I love what Melissa had to say and her life experience and what she tries to demonstrate. I've tried to work in the area of education, which includes a decent breakfast and a decent lunch, and that sort. It's part of it with me. But at the end of the day, we need to have a workforce, a population, a community that has enough education so that it can be flexible, that it can change. When newspapers go out of business, as we watch them die, a lot of good people are without work, and now hopefully they have the education skills to be flexible. That happens in industry after industry, faster and faster. That's why I spend a lot of my time in my business world creating jobs, starting companies, helping companies grow, providing opportunity. I don't want America just to be a big plant, a big manufacturing plant. I want to have all this diversity so we can change as we want to. But you put your finger on the issue of our time. Given all of our wealth and how smart we are, we still have people who can't make it, who don't have 2 meals a day, much less 3. We still have babies without hope. It breaks your heart.
So my last thing I'll just say, food, housing, and healthcare are first. They're human rights. Most of the rest of the world have decided that they're human rights. I don't know why we wrangle about them in this country. I don't know why they are fodder for political campaigns. I don't know why you can call somebody the food stamp president and mock them for feeding people in their country. But that's what happened this year in this country, right? I mean, our president was mocked for feeding people, right? at the behest of Republican governors who asked them to feed his people, which was a good thing for Republican governors to go and ask for, right? But food, housing, and healthcare first, period. And the problem is we're not like, on the Maslow's hierarchy, we have not decided that as a country, that those three things are human rights. And I don't think we get much farther until we do. Second is education and human development, because once you are fed and housed and well, then the next thing you have to be is human. This is the life, liberty, and then the pursuit of happiness part, right? It's instantiated in our documents as Americans that we believe that meeting the fundamental needs of human beings is only part of what government is instituted among the people to do. The other part of what it is meant to do is to allow free people to have the capacity for human development. That's education. And then everything else. And so I think there are easy answers. And I think the most easy of the answers is if you have 3 houses or 2 houses or excess income and somebody's hungry, you have to give up some, period. And I'm not sorry to say that. And I'm not afraid to say that. And there's a lot of the world who, in this country, who believes that if you cannot have uber wealth and keep all of your uber wealth, then there is not sufficient purpose for entrepreneurship. And I do think you have to reward entrepreneurship, and I do think people have to be allowed to consume their own wealth, and I think people have to be able to make all kinds of choices about how they consume their wealth. I also think that it is perfectly reasonable to ask everybody else to help pay for their neighbors. And it's because if your neighbor is not fed or clothed or educated, he breaks into your house at Christmas. And like, you get a hell of a lot clearer than that when you live next to your neighbor who doesn't have enough food and housing and healthcare and education. And it's real easy to forget that when your neighbor is just theoretical and you live behind a wall somewhere. But I'm just telling you, like, it's not doing something for someone else. It is our requirement. It is the thing that we are meant to be doing in the context of all of us being inherently creative people. That, for me, that is the easy answer.
All right, well, let's thank both of them for their time. Very interesting and entertaining. We appreciate both of you. Any final thoughts over here?
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to thank the speakers. And I will promise to Lee that we will get his Twitter following up if he agrees to do moderate our next big issue, which is in January. And thank God we hit upon one of the pillars for Melissa. It will be about healthcare. So look out for January. Sign up. You'll get on the listserv. You'll hear about all the next big issues coming up. As we can see, there are many of them. There's a dessert reception. Enjoy. Have a good night. Drive safe.
Sounds good.